The wind came screaming down from the mountains like it had a grudge to settle. Luke Travers hunched low in his saddle shoulders, braced against the frozen blast, his wool coat already stiff with snow. The world was a shifting blur of white sky, and ground the same merciless color, and his breath came ragged, burning in his throat, as if the storm had crawled down inside him. His mare Dusty fought to keep her footing, nostrils flaring, legs trembling beneath her. He patted her neck, though his fingers were too numb to feel it. "Easy, girl. Don't you fall on me now." He couldn't see 10 feet in front of him. Somewhere behind his scattered herd of cattle was likely half buried by now, bones freezing under drifts. Somewhere ahead, he wasn't sure where was the ridge that led back to the ranch. Or maybe not. Truth was, he could be riding in circles, could be passing the same crooked pine for the 3rd time. Snow had a way of erasing things, making everything feel like nowhere, and that's where he felt he was nowhere. Nothing but wind and cold and white silence, broken only by the groan of old leather and the whip of ice in the air. He'd tried to get the cattle to lower ground before the sky turned, but the storm came in faster than any he'd seen in the 5 winters since he took over the ranch. The clouds rolled in like an army and dropped the temperature by 30 degrees in minutes. Now it was just him and the horse, and the kind of cold that made a man think about regrets. Luke coughed, swallowed blood from a lip cracked by wind, and blinked through freezing lashes. No use thinking now. Thinking was slow. Thinking was death. He needed shelter, anything. A hollow, a thicket, a damned pile of rocks. Something to get out of this wind before it peeled the skin from his bones. The horse stumbled, nearly pitching him sideways. He caught the saddle horn, gritting his teeth as pain flared in his shoulder. Dusty's ears twitched, then her head lifted, nostrils flaring again. She smelled something. "What is it?" Luke rasped, barely hearing his own voice. She shifted direction on her own. He let her, trusted her more than his own frozen instincts. Then a flicker, just a shimmer through the snow, a glow that shouldn't be there. He blinked, squinted. His eyes played tricks in weather like this. It could have been ice reflection, could have been the last thing a dying man sees. But Dusty kept moving, more sure with every step. The glow grew into shape, tall, pointed, flickering from within. Not a cabin, a teepee. He stared, disbelief punching through the numb. A teepee meant people, meant warmth, or danger. His father's words rang in his head sharp as the wind. Don't trust 'em. Kindness is how they bait the hook. Luke nearly laughed, bitter and dry. Didn't matter. If he stayed out here, he'd be dead before the snow covered his legs. He slid from the saddle. His boots sank almost to the knee, and he stumbled, catching himself on the mare's flank. The air burned inside his chest. He staggered toward the flap of the teepee, one arm shielding his face, the other dragging behind him like a broken thing. At the entrance, he hesitated. Smoke curled from the top. Light flickered beneath stretched hide. He lifted a frozen fist and knocked once against the support pole. "Hello," his voice cracked. "Please, I'm lost." Storm. The flap moved. A woman stood in the firelight, silhouetted, dark eyes catching the flames. She didn't speak, just stared. Young, maybe 20. Her hair was braided over her shoulder, black as obsidian. Behind her, another shape rose, a woman older by a few years, stronger in build, arms crossed over a heavy shawl. Her eyes flicked to something beside the fire. Luke didn't need to see it to know it was a rifle. He lifted his hands. "I ain't here for trouble. I'm just cold. My horse, too." The women exchanged a few words in their language, quiet and fast. Then the younger one stepped aside. Her voice was soft, but firm. "Bring the horse. Storm kills fast." He nodded, dazed, and stumbled back to Dusty. The older sister followed without a word, helping him tie the mare in the rock shelter beside the teepee. Her fingers were quick, sure, silent. Inside, the heat hit him like a fist. He collapsed beside the fire hands, shaking uncontrollably. The teepee smelled like leather and pine smoke and something earthy boiling in a pot near the coals. Buffalo robes lined the ground. He couldn't stop shivering. The younger woman handed him a blanket. "Sit, before you fall." He did. Couldn't do much else. "I'm Luke Travers," he managed, breath-catching. "Ranch is somewhere south." The woman nodded once. "I am Nelina. My sister is Sahali." He looked at them, really looked now. They were alone. No men. No other campfires. Just these two women on the edge of the mountain living where no one dared. Sahali watched him like a hawk, arms still crossed. Nelina poured something steaming into a clay cup and handed it to him. He took it with both hands, nearly dropped it from the tremors. It tasted sharp, herbs, roots, warmth. It went down like fire and settled like life. He closed his eyes. Let the heat do its work. When he opened them again, both women were still there. Watching. Not with fear, not with kindness either. Just watching. "Why help me?" he asked, voice rough. Sahali said nothing, but Nelina met his gaze and answered without blinking. "Storm does not ask what name you carry. Cold does not care what skin you wear. We help because you breathe." Something inside him cracked, quiet and sharp. He looked down at the trembling hands, the wet boots, the scorched tea in his throat, and felt the first warmth not just in his body, but in his chest. Outside, the wind howled like a dying animal, but here inside the small circle of firelight, he was alive. He didn't yet know what it meant that these women had saved him, or what it would cost. But he knew this: he wasn't ready to leave. Fire doesn't care who you are, it just knows if you need it. The heat wrapped around Luke Travers like something alive pressing into his bones, making his skin prickle with a pain that felt almost personal. The kind that came when the blood started to move again, thawing limbs near dead. He sat hunched close to the fire, wrapped in a buffalo robe, boots steaming as melted snow pooled around them. His jaw still trembled, the cold not fully gone, but the worst had passed. Nelina moved with quiet precision around the small teepee. She added a few sticks to the fire, stirred the pot, hanging low above the coals, then sat cross-legged near him, eyes lowered, but not avoiding him. Sahali remained standing near the door, flap arms folded, her gaze hard as flint. She hadn't spoken since he came in. Her rifle leaned against the wall, close enough to grab with half a breath. Luke didn't blame her. He wouldn't have trusted a stranger either. Not out here. Not now. The teepee smelled of things he couldn't name, smoke herbs, leather worn smooth with age. Above the thin gap at the top, let smoke curl out into the night. The storm still howled beyond the canvas, but it was different now, more distant. Like a dog that had already bitten and was now pacing circles, his voice came out raw. "Thank you for letting me in." Nelina gave the barest nod. "Storm would have taken you." Sahali made a sound, not quite agreement, not quite protest. Luke looked at her. "You didn't want to." Her eyes narrowed. "We've seen men freeze before." That was all she said, but the words landed sharp. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he added. "You are trouble," she said flatly. He looked down at his hands, cracked and red skin flaking at the knuckles, not on purpose. For a long moment, silence filled the space between them. The only sound was the low crackle of the fire and the distant moan of the wind outside. Then Nelina reached for a small bowl and passed it to him. "Night." He took it unsure what it was, some kind of thick stew rich with herbs and meat he didn't recognize, but it was hot and full of life. He ate slowly, feeling it settle like warmth deep in his gut. "You live alone?" Nalina asked after a while, not looking at him directly. "Yeah," he said. "Far side of the southern ridge. Old cabin. Been mine since I turned 18. Took it over after my folks passed. 5 years," she asked. He nodded. Sahali finally stepped away from the flap, circling to squat beside her sister, still watching him like a hawk watches a field. "Why alone?" Luke shrugged, though the motion hurt. "Wasn't much choice. Neighbors mostly keep to themselves. Town folks think I'm strange. Quiet. I don't talk much unless I have to." "That part is true," Sahali muttered. He gave a dry huff of a laugh. "Used to it. Got land, got cattle, got enough to keep going. But not enough to live," Nalina said quietly. That stopped him. He looked at her. She still hadn't met his eyes. She just stirred her own bowl, slow, thoughtful. But the words had weight. Heavy ones. "You always speak that plain. I don't know how to lie pretty," she said. Sahale smirked, just barely. "She speaks what she sees. Sometimes it makes folks uneasy." "No," Luke said after a beat. "I'd rather hear the truth." Something passed between the sisters, then a glance subtle but full of meaning. He couldn't read it, but it wasn't hostile. Maybe cautious. Maybe something else. "Where is your family?" he asked, realizing the question was dangerous the moment it left his mouth. Sahali stiffened. Nalina, to his surprise, answered first. "Gone," she said. "Soldiers moved our people, promised safety, gave sickness." Luke swallowed hard. "I'm sorry." "It's not your sorry we need," Sahali said. "I know," he replied, and meant it. The wind screamed again, louder this time, bending the poles of the teepee with a long, low groan. Dusty the mare whinnied faintly from where she was tied outside under the rock overhang. Luke's heart kicked. "My horse, she is safe," Nalina said. "We gave her feed, water. She is warm as she can be." He sat back, the tension sliding a little from his shoulders. "Thank you." Sahale poked the fire with a stick, not looking at him. "You'll leave when the storm breaks." It wasn't a question, more like a line in the dirt. Luke nodded slowly. "I will. I ain't looking to stay where I'm not wanted." "You were dying," she said. "That's the only reason you're here." He didn't argue. Couldn't. But something inside him stirred. Not anger, not shame. Something quieter. Like something had cracked just enough for air to get in. He remembered the dark look of his cabin. The silence. The sound of wind blowing through chinks in the wallboards at night. The way the fire sometimes felt like the only heartbeat left in the place. Nalina stood and moved to the edge of the teepee, checking something in a leather pouch hung near the entrance. A bundle of herbs. She pressed it to her palm, then tied it back up with care. She looked at him, then finally meeting his eyes. "You will sleep now," she said. "Rest helps the body mend." He nodded, heavy with exhaustion. She handed him another blanket. He laid back on the furs beside the fire. The ache in his muscles finally dulled under the warmth, the scent of smoke and earth lulling him down. He looked across the fire at the two sisters. Sahale was still alert, eyes open, face unreadable. Nalina leaned her head against the wall, half watching the flames, half somewhere else entirely. Before sleep took him, Luke spoke again, his voice barely above the crackle of the fire. "Fire doesn't care who you are," he said. "It just knows if you need it." He didn't expect them to answer. He wasn't even sure he was speaking to them. But just before his eyes closed, he heard Nalina's voice again. Soft, almost a whisper. "Same is true for storms. and in the dark warmth of that teepee with snow clawing at the world outside, Luke Travers slept deeper than he had in years. When Nalina said his name back to him, Luke, it felt like someone had touched a scar without making it hurt. Light came slow through the smoke hole, pale and cold. The storm had passed, but the wind outside still carried its echo brushing against the teepee like a memory refusing to leave. Luke lay on his back, cocooned in furs, the fire now a nest of embers glowing beneath ash. His body ached in a way that felt earned, not like suffering, but like survival. He sat up stiff and still cold around the edges. Across the teepee, Nalina knelt beside a hide, stitching a tear with patient, even movements. She didn't look up when he stirred, but her voice reached him soft and clear. "You didn't move much. That's good. Didn't know I could," he said, rubbing at his shoulder. "Feels like I've been trampled." "You were frozen," she replied. "It takes time." He nodded, then glanced around. Sahale was gone. "Your sister checking traps." Alone, now she looked up. "We are not helpless. I didn't say that. You thought it." He held her gaze, then smiled faintly. "I guess I did." She went back to stitching. "You don't mean harm. That's clear now. But we've learned not to trust what a man means." Luke looked down at his hands. The fire had thawed the cold, but not the guilt in his chest. "You got reason." They sat in silence after that, but it wasn't hard like before. It was easy. Like the quiet that settles after something honest is said out loud. When he stepped out of the teepee, the sun had climbed just high enough to make the snow shine like sugar. The sky was endless blue clouds, thin and stretched. His mare Dusty stood huddled in the shelter of the rocks, her breath rising in soft puffs. He checked her legs, ran a hand down her neck, murmured nonsense just for the sound of it. She leaned into him like she remembered last night, too. From the ridge beyond the clearing, Sahal returned with a bundle over one shoulder. A rabbit dangled by its feet from a length of cord. She didn't greet him, just nodded once as she passed, disappearing inside the teepee. Luke followed at a respectful distance. Later, when the stew was on again, and the teepee filled with warmth and the scent of herbs, Nalina offered him a second bowl. He ate slower this time, more aware of their eyes, of the space he was in, borrowed, hard-earned, not his. "I can head out soon," he said. "Should check my cattle, see what the storm left me." "You won't make it far before dark," Sahali said. "I've ridden in worse." Nalina tilted her head, not unkindly. "But you won't ride as far alone. Not after this." Luke looked at her, then away. The words landed too close to places he didn't show. "You live alone?" she asked. He nodded. 5 years now, since my ma passed from fever. Pa took a fall off his horse the winter after. Left the ranch to me. Not much, but it's land." "Do you miss them every day?" he said more quickly than he meant to. Another silence stretched between them, but this one had weight and warmth. Nalina stirred the pot. Sahale worked a knife across the rabbit's skin with practiced ease. "Our mother died on the reservation," Nalina said quietly. "They gave us moldy flour, sick water. She got weak, wouldn't leave her bed. Then the soldiers took her, said they'd bring her to the healer. We never saw her again." Luke's chest tightened. "I'm sorry." "Sorry doesn't change bones," Sahali said. "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." She paused. Her work glanced up at him, and for the first time, didn't look like she was ready to send him out with the wind. After the meal, Luke helped carry water from a trickle of melt that ran down the rocks nearby. Nalina showed him the way to hold the wooden ladle so it didn't spill. Her hands were quick, but gentle, worn from use, but graceful. She didn't talk much as they worked, but she didn't flinch from his closeness either. On the way back, she asked, "Why do you stay out here alone, Safer?" he said. For who he stopped walking. The bucket sloshed. "I don't know anymore." She didn't push further, just walked beside him in silence, the wind lifting strands of her braid as they moved. That evening, as shadows lengthened and the teepee glowed soft and amber, a fourth figure appeared, wrapped in a wool shawl, a wide-brimmed hat low over her brow. Nalina smiled. Rosario. The woman entered with the familiarity of a relative. Her skin was coppered, her hair thick with gray, but her eyes were sharp and young. She set down a leather pouch and gave Luke a glance that felt like a test passed in advance. "So this is the one the storm dragged in," she said. Luke rose awkwardly. "Ma'am, no need for manners," Rosario said, waving him off. "If they didn't turn you out, you've done something right. Or pitiful enough." He smiled. "Maybe both." She laughed full and rich. "You're not as stiff as I expected. That's good." Rosario unpacked her pouch bundles of herbs, dried roots, small cloth bags. She handed Sahaley something wrapped in wax paper, kissed Nalina's cheek, then settled herself near the fire. "They'll feed you," she said to Luke, "but they don't talk much." "That's why I come." "They talk," Luke said. "If you listen right." That made Nalina smile. Just a small one, but he saw it, and it landed deep. Rosario leaned back, studying him over her cup. "You're the quiet type, then." Luke shrugged, never saw much use in talking to people who weren't listening. "And what about these two?" He glanced toward Nalina, whose face was calm, unreadable, but her eyes were waiting. "I think I'm finally in the right place for that," he said. Rosario gave a knowing nod. Then to no one in particular, she said, "This one walks like someone who forgot why he's still alive." The teepee fell quiet again. Not awkward, just full of things not yet spoken. Outside, the sky began to clear, stars pushing through the black. The wind had slowed to a whisper. Luke sat back, arms around his knees, and let the fire warm his face. And when Nalina passed him a small carved cup and said softly, "Luke," he didn't correct her pronunciation, didn't flinch. It sounded right. Sounded like something remembered. "If they find us, it won't be a conversation, it'll be a reckoning." The snow had settled in deep folds across the ridge by morning, softening the land into a blanket of false peace. But Luke knew better. Snow might hide tracks, but it didn't erase tension. It only muffled it. Made the silence thicker. Made things harder to hear until they were too close. He stood outside the teepee, cinching the girth on Dusty's saddle. His fingers, though mostly healed, still cracked at the edges. His joints ached with the kind of cold that got into your bones and made a home. But his mind was clearer than it had been in months. Maybe years. He hadn't left yet. The storm had passed 2 days ago, the sky now a sharp, endless blue, and he'd told himself each morning he'd ride out. Get back to his cattle. See what was left. But each night when the fire cracked low and Nalina moved through the teepee in calm, careful rhythms, he'd stayed. Now he wasn't sure if he could leave, even if he tried. He turned toward the sound of footsteps on snow. Sahaley was climbing the slope behind the teepee, her boots moving sure over the ice-glazed rocks. She had her rifle slung across her back, and her long, dark braid tucked into her scarf. She didn't wave, didn't speak until she was beside him. 3 riders, she said, her voice flat. Coming from the south trail, angling toward the ridge. Luke's stomach tightened. How close? Half-mile, maybe. 15 minutes out. He looked up the slope where she'd come from, then back toward the trees that shielded the teepee. The wind stirred the pine branches gently, but there was no sound of hooves. Not yet, but he trusted her word. "You recognize them?" She nodded once. The one in front, long brown coat. Yellow scarf. Luke closed his eyes. Crowley. Sahali tilted her head. You know him. Emmett Crowley. Ranch north of mine. Runs cattle and mouths both too wide. His son rides with him. Caleb. Hot-headed. Dangerous in a group. The third, probably Wade Mercer. At that name, Sahali's lips thinned. Mercer, she said, spitting the word like a bitter root. We've heard stories. Believe all of them, Luke said. He's not a man who comes to visit. Sahali shifted her hand, brushing the rifle strap. They see the teepee, we'll have to move again. Luke stepped forward, shaking his head. Let me go meet them. They know me. If I get to them first, I can steer them off. Make it sound like I camped alone, maybe caught in the storm. You think they'll believe that I don't know, he admitted. But if I don't try, they'll ride straight into this clearing. And then it won't be a conversation, it'll be a reckoning. Sahali studied him. Her eyes narrowed, measuring. Then slowly she nodded. Nalina appeared, then quiet as a breeze, her eyes wide. You shouldn't go alone, she said. Luke turned to her, and for the first time since arriving, took her hand without asking. It was warm and strong and trembling just slightly. I'll be careful, he said. I promise. She didn't speak, just looked at him for a long time, then let go. Sahela handed him a small bundle of herbs. For your pocket, she said, in case you forget who you're standing for. He tucked it away without a word, then mounted Dusty and turned her toward the edge of the trees. He didn't ride fast, didn't want to look panicked. The air was still brittle as he crested the ridge and came into view. Emmett Crowley raised a hand and slowed his horse. Caleb was behind him, the kid's face half buried in a scarf, eyes restless. And behind them, Wade Mercer sat slouched in his saddle, chewing a matchstick, looking like he hadn't changed clothes or cleaned his soul in weeks. Luke Emmett called out, Well, hell, boy, thought the storm took you clean off the earth. Luke forced a tight smile. Nearly did. Figured we'd swing by your place, see if your herd made it. Followed your tracks a ways. Saw smoke from up on the rise. Luke kept his posture loose. Had to hole up during the storm. Found shelter between the rocks. Built a fire. Waited it out. Caleb peered past him, eyes narrowing. Didn't think there was nothing up here but snow and scrub. Luke nodded. There wasn't. Just me, a bad storm, and a lucky patch of dry ground. Wade spat into the snow. Or maybe not so lucky. Saw signs of other campfires. Not yours. Different wood. Indian style. Luke felt the heat rise in his throat, but he didn't let it show. I burned whatever I could find. Didn't stop to check style. Wade's eyes gleamed. You wouldn't be shacked up with some squaws, would you? The word hit Luke like a slap. His back stiffened, but he stayed calm. Watch your mouth. Wade laughed. Easy, cowboy. Ain't saying anything you haven't thought. Emmett cleared his throat. We're just looking, Luke. Storm's got everyone on edge. Didn't mean nothing. Luke dismounted slowly, standing tall between them and the path behind. Well, there's nothing to find here. Just snow and rocks and a man trying to get home. You've seen me. You've seen the ridge. Now it's time to turn around. Wade opened his mouth, but didn't get the chance to speak, because from the rocky outcropping above, the sharp, metallic sound of a rifle being cocked sliced through the air. Sahali stood there, her stance rigid, rifle trained on Wade Mercer's chest. She didn't speak, didn't flinch. The three men froze. Caleb swore. Emmett paled. Put that down, Miss Emmett called. No one wants trouble here, she's protecting herself, Luke said. Davis started it. Wade spat again, more out of pride than aggression now. Figures you'd defend them, I'd defend anyone who saved my life, Luke said, voice low and clear. A beat of silence hung in the air. Then behind them, hooves crunched on snow. Another rider approached from the east, tall, calm rifle resting easy in one hand. Sheriff Clay Rios. "Morning, boys," he said. "Didn't expect to find a standoff up here. Anyone want to explain?" No one did. Sheriff's eyes moved from Luke to Wade, then up to Sahale, and finally back again. "I'll say this once. Nobody here's breaking any laws. These women have every right to be on this land. Same as any of you." Wade muttered something and turned his horse. Hyleb followed, face flushed. Emmett tipped his hat to Luke without meeting his eyes. As they rode off, Sheriff Rios nodded to Luke. "You all right?" Luke exhaled slowly. "Now I am." "You're lucky," the sheriff said. "She had a dead man in her sights." "She still might," Luke muttered. Sheriff grinned and rode after the others. Luke turned back toward the rocks. Sahale hadn't moved. When he reached her, she lowered the rifle. "You could have gotten shot," he said. "So could you," she replied calmly. "But you stood for us." Nalina was waiting at the edge of the trees, her arms wrapped around herself. When he came close, she didn't speak, just touched his chest with one hand, feeling for something more than a heartbeat. "You protect us," she said quietly. "We protect you." Luke placed his hand over hers. And for the first time since that storm nearly claimed him, he understood what it meant to belong. He told himself it was just a thank you visit, but the sugar tin in his pack said otherwise. Luke rode with the sun behind him, its low light warming the back of his neck even as the wind coming off the ridge stayed sharp and biting. His saddle creaked softly beneath him, Dusty's hooves crunching over ice-rutted dirt. He'd left at first light after a mostly sleepless night. The fire at his cabin had burned too quiet, and the shadows too long. The place had always felt empty, but after the warmth of that teepee and the voices inside it, the silence now felt personal. He told himself the ride was necessary. He owed them a proper thank you, something more than a nod and a half-whispered promise. They had taken him in, saved his life. That deserved more than vanishing without a word. But truth was, he hadn't stopped thinking about Nalina's voice. The way it sounded saying his name. The way her eyes met his without flinching. He had wrapped a tin of sugar and a small bag of ground coffee in a wool cloth and tied it with a piece of string. There was flour in his saddlebag, some dried meat too, but it was the sugar he kept glancing at tucked in beside the rifle holster, like a secret he wasn't ready to name. By the time he reached the rise above their camp, the air was warming. Patches of snow had melted along the sunlit side of the ridge, revealing dry tufts of grass. Smoke curled up from the teepee, steady and clean. He felt something loosen in his chest at the sight of it. Sahale saw him first. She stepped out from behind a juniper bush, her bow slung across her back, one hand resting on the handle of a knife at her belt. "You came back." Luke nodded, keeping his hands visible. "Brought supplies. Thought it was the least I could do." She stared at him for a long moment, then gave a single nod and turned back toward the camp without saying more. Nalina stepped out from the teepee just as he reached the clearing. She squinted against the sun, a hand shading her brow. When she saw it was him, her expression didn't change much, but something in her shoulders eased. "I brought a few things," Luke said, dismounting. "Flour, coffee, sugar, too." "Sugar," Nalina repeated, her voice unreadable. "For tea?" He shrugged, suddenly self-conscious. Seemed like something worth sharing. She took the bundle from him, careful and quiet. "We thank you." Her fingers brushed his, just for a second, and it was enough to short out his breath. He stepped back and cleared his throat. "How's Dusty?" she asked. "She's well. Tired. Like me. Saheli crouched near the fire, setting a pot over the coals. You sleep at all in that empty cabin of yours, some Luke said. Not much. He didn't say why. He didn't have to. The camp looked the same, neat, tucked into the folds of the rocks like it had grown there. The buffalo hides had been cleaned and rehung, the fire pit deepened to catch wind. A new bundle of herbs hung drying from a crosspole. Looks like you've been busy, he said, admiring the changes. Spring comes early to this land, Nelena replied. We prepare before it fools us. He smiled at that. They ate lunch together, stew and fresh cornbread from a pan balanced over the fire. Luke didn't ask where they'd gotten cornmeal. He figured the sisters had ways of getting what they needed that didn't rely on the charity of men. Rosario arrived not long after, her shawl bright against the muted earth. She greeted Luke with a wink and sat down without asking. Was wondering when you'd turn up again, she said. A man doesn't ride away from warm hands and full bowls that easy. I tried, Luke admitted. Didn't take. Rosario snorted. No surprise there. You walk like a man who left something behind. Nelena didn't look up, but her hands slowed where she was slicing dried roots. Sahali spoke over her shoulder. He brought sugar. Rosario gave a low, knowing hum. Sugar for tea, she said, nodding, or something sweeter. Luke turned red down to his collar. I didn't mean anything. No, Rosario asked, not unkindly. Then why bring the thing she likes most? He didn't answer. Sahali smirked and passed him another bowl of stew. Eat, your tongue's useless right now. They stayed quiet for a while after that, the sounds of wind and fire doing the talking. Luke found he didn't mind the silence here. It was a living kind of quiet, one that held presence, not absence. After the meal, Saheli rose and stretched. I'll check the east traps. Want company? Luke asked. She shook her head. No. Stay. You talk better with Nelena than with me. He blinked, surprised by her bluntness. Nelena only lifted her eyes for a second, then went back to sorting leaves into bundles. When the camp was still again, Luke found himself sitting beside her. Neither spoke at first. Then she handed him a handful of small, brightly colored beads. Try, she said, nodding at the leather strip she'd laid out. We make a pattern together. He fumbled clumsy with the small pieces, his fingers too big, too stiff. You're not gentle, she said after a moment. No, he agreed. Never had to be. You don't live gentle, but you move like someone who wants to. He paused, bead halfway strung. Maybe I didn't know how he said. She watched him closely, then reached to guide his fingers. Their hands touched, stayed touching. A silence settled that had nothing to do with shyness and everything to do with what wasn't being said. I never had anyone to learn from, he added, quieter now. No one to show me what a steady life looks like. And now she asked, not looking away. He swallowed. Now. I'm not sure I want to keep being alone. She drew her hand back slowly, the warmth of it lingering. Alone keeps you safe, she said. But not whole, he replied. Rosario from across the camp pretended to look at her herbs, but said just loud enough. Some storms don't come with snow. Some just come with people who finally speak. That night, Luke stayed by the fire longer than he needed to. Dusty was tied safe, the sky overhead scattered with stars. The teepee glowed behind him, flickering gold on hide. He stood there for a long time, staring at that light. And for the first time, he wasn't afraid of walking toward it. This land don't belong to either of us, but somehow, this place knows us both. The creek wound through the narrow valley like it had been drawn with care, slow curves, smooth stones, and a hush that felt older than anything Luke could name. The snow had mostly melted here except for scattered patches in the shaded places beneath the pines. Above them, the cliffs stood silent, guarding the hidden world below. Nalina walked a few paces ahead, her braid swinging gently down her back. Luke followed, leading Dusty by the reins. The mare stepped lightly on the moss-lined path, ears flicking with each rustle of wind. They'd been walking for nearly an hour, deeper into a fold of land Luke didn't even know existed. He'd thought he knew every trail and pass around the ridges near his ranch. But this place, this narrow green basin surrounded by stone, was something else entirely. "It stays warm here," Nalina said, breaking the quiet. "Even when the snow is deep above. There's a spring, and herbs that don't sleep in winter." Luke looked around. The sunlight here was different, filtered, soft, and the air carried a scent of sage, wild mint, and something else he couldn't name. He could see why she brought him. "You plan to stay here?" he asked. "For a while? Not far from your land, but hidden enough to be safe." He nodded slowly. "I've lived out here 5 years and never knew this place existed." She gave a small smile over her shoulder. "That's because it didn't call to you." He thought about that as they moved forward, stepping over a fallen log half covered in moss. The thought that land could call to someone, choose someone, that was something his father never would have believed. But Luke believed it, now more than ever. They reached the clearing where the spring bubbled from beneath a rock shelf. It wasn't big, just a pool, no wider than a wagon wheel, but it steamed in the cool morning air, giving off a faint warmth that wrapped around his boots. Sahali was already there, crouched beside a pile of cut branches. She looked up as they approached and jerked her chin toward the edge of the clearing. Flat ground over there for the teepee. Rock wall behind. "We'll get less wind." "You moving in already?" Luke asked. "Always move fast when it's safe," she replied. He tied Dusty to a scrub pine and joined her. Together they started clearing a patch of ground, working side by side without much talk. He handed her stones to build a fire ring while she laid out hides to dry in the sun. He liked the way she worked, efficient, no fuss. She didn't waste words or motion. Everything she did was purposeful, the way a hawk moves on the wind. Nalina returned with a bundle of greens and roots tucked into her shawl. "Wild onion," she said, "and yarrow, early bloom. Good signs." Luke stood brushing dirt from his palms. "You're really settling in?" She nodded. "If we're going to stay near your land, this is the best place. Easier to watch, easier to run." He frowned. "You shouldn't have to think that way." "We always have to think that way," Sahali said, not unkindly. "It's how we've lasted this long." The three of them worked together through the day. They erected a new teepee using the same hides from the winter camp, stretched now over a stronger frame. Luke helped carry logs for the fire, watched as Nalina stacked flat stones for cooking. He taught her how to spot which trees nearby would drop limbs first in high wind, which way the smoke curled when snow was coming. In return, she showed him the small herb garden growing near the spring, tiny shoots, barely visible to his untrained eye. "These are called tachi," she said, pointing. "Good for fevers. Only grow near running water." He bent down beside her. "You ever think about teaching this stuff?" She gave him a sidelong look. "To who? To me?" She tilted her head, thoughtful. "You'd listen." He nodded. "Never had much reason to before. But now, I think I want to understand what you see." A quiet passed between them, not tense, just full of something unspoken. "You listen well," she said at last. He smiled. Never had anyone worth listening to. Her eyes held his for a second longer than they needed to. Then she stood and brushed the dirt from her knees. By late afternoon, the new camp was taking shape. Smoke drifted from the teepee, soft and steady. The sun slanted low, catching the tops of the pine trees with gold. Luke leaned against a rock, watching the sisters finish tying down the entrance flap. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he'd done something useful, like he'd helped build something, not just fix or survive or endure. "This land don't belong to either of us," he said half to himself. "But somehow, this place knows us both." Sahali heard him and gave a rare approving nod. "Maybe that's why it's quiet here." Nalina looked at him, soft light in her eyes. "Or maybe it's because no one's yelling at it." They laughed, a quiet shared moment that felt easy, like they'd always done it. As evening fell, they sat near the fire, the warmth rolling over them in slow waves. Luke pulled out a small tin from his saddlebag, more sugar, and handed it to Nalina. Her smile was small, but it lit her face. "You'll spoil us. I can think of worse things," he said. Rosario arrived not long after, drawn by the smoke or instinct or both. She settled into the circle like she belonged, nodding at the new setup, giving Sahele a once-over that meant approval. "Looks good," she said. "Looks like staying." Luke looked around at the clearing, at the rising smoke, the bubbling spring, the quiet peace of a place untouched by men like Crowley or Mercer. He looked at Nalina, her fingers moving through beads by firelight, calm and sure, and something settled in his chest. He'd ridden out that morning thinking it was just another visit. But standing in this hidden valley, seeing it all take shape, he knew he'd stepped into something bigger, something rooted. They weren't just surviving now. They were making a place, and he wasn't outside of it anymore. Their fingers brushed over a string of beads, and suddenly Luke knew what it meant to want something fragile. The sun hung low and golden over the basin as Luke tied off the last section of fence along the northern edge of the camp. The days were stretching longer now, shadows thinner, the wind no longer biting, but carrying the dry smell of earth and thawing roots. Spring was waking slowly, and the land was stirring with it. He wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand and stepped back to look over his work. 4 posts set solid, a clean line of cedar rail fitted between them. It wasn't ranch fancy, but it would keep curious coyotes out of the camp's food stores and give the sisters some sense of barrier, at least from wandering animals. People were harder. Sahale stepped up beside him, a coil of rope slung over her shoulder. She gave the fence a hard look and then a short nod. "You learn quick," Had to Luke said. "First winter alone, I didn't know what the hell I was doing. Lost 3 head of cattle and broke my collarbone falling off a patch of ice." "Sounds like a fool's winter." "It was," he said. "But I lived through it. Mostly out of spite." Sahali smirked and handed him a canteen. That's how most people live. They drank in companionable silence, the kind that had become more common between them. She didn't talk unless something needed saying, but Luke was starting to understand her rhythm. She trusted action over words, and she'd been watching him closely since the day he stood in front of Wade Mercer's gun. "You build that stretch faster than I expected," she said, nodding toward the ridge. "Figured if I helped with the fence, you might stop looking at me like a trespasser." "You're not a trespasser," she said simply. "Just a man waiting to be useful." Luke took that as the highest kind of compliment. Later, while Sahele went to check the snares along the creek, Luke found Nalina seated near the fire, a shallow wooden bowl in her lap, sorting tiny colored beads into patterns. She looked up as he approached, a smile rising slow on her lips. "Come to learn beadwork. I've got thick fingers," he said. "Never been good with delicate things." She patted the space beside her. "Then today's a good day to start." He sat unsure of how to hold himself. Nalina handed him a leather strip and motioned for him to watch. She moved with quiet grace, threading the fine needle with steady hands. The beads clicked softly as she pressed them into the leather, forming a repeating pattern of white, red, and dark blue. This one means earth, she said, pointing to a wide white bead. This one is blood. And this. She tapped a translucent blue. Sky before snow. Do all patterns tell a story? Yes. Sometimes a warning, sometimes a prayer, sometimes just something to carry the hands through silence. Luke held the strip of leather between his fingers. It felt strange and small, like trying to hold water. I never knew, he said. No one showed you? He nodded, watching her work. Seems like there's a lot I never learned. You're learning now, she said, and passed him a thread. Their fingers touched just barely, but it was enough. A spark passed between them, light but impossible to ignore. Luke froze the thread, still dangling from his thumb. Nelina's hand stayed near his for a second longer than needed. When he looked up, her eyes were on his, calm and open, and he knew right then that if he let this moment pass, he'd carry the weight of it forever. She spoke first, her voice low. Most men who look at me do it like they're stealing something. I'm not like most men. I know. He swallowed. But I'm still trying to figure out who I am when I'm not alone. That's the work of living, she said gently, figuring out what to do with the silence once it's filled. Luke lowered his head, a dry chuckle escaping his chest. You always speak in riddles. They're not riddles, she said. They're just truths, said soft. He looked at her again, really looked and felt something in his chest loosen. For so long he'd been braced against winter, against grief, against hope. Now something was breaking open. Not with pain, but with need. The kind that wasn't loud or wild, but steady. A wanting that felt sacred. You ever wish things were simpler, he asked. No, she said. Simple things break too easy. Their hands met again over the beads. He didn't pull away this time. Neither did she. Just then, Saheli's voice rang out from the edge of the trees. Riders. The word shattered the moment like glass on stone. Luke was on his feet instantly, heart kicking into his ribs. He turned toward the ridge and saw 3 silhouettes distant but moving with purpose. One of them wore a familiar hat, low-brimmed and worn. Wade, he muttered. Damn it. Sahale was already moving her rifle across her backknife in her belt. Nelina stood as well, her face unreadable, now calm like water before it breaks. You go inside, Sahale said to her sister. No, Nelina said. I won't hide? Luke turned to them both. Let me ride up and meet them. I can slow them down. They know you're with us, Sahale said. They don't know what that means yet, he replied. But they'll listen to me longer than they'll listen to a bullet. Nelina reached for his arm. Be careful. He held her gaze. I'll come back. She nodded, her fingers tightening on his wrist before letting go. Luke turned, vaulted onto Dusty, and rode fast toward the ridge, heart thudding harder than hooves. As he rode, he reached into his coat pocket, feeling the little bundle of beads Nelina had slipped into his palm. Sky before snow. He didn't know what was waiting up ahead, but for the first time he wasn't riding alone. Not truly. And whatever came next, he knew where his place was. We can't stay hidden forever, something's coming, and I think it knows our names. Luke rode hard toward the rise wind, snapping his coat as Dusty lunged up the incline. The shapes ahead were coming fast. 3 riders wide across the trail with that stiff, entitled posture of men who didn't expect to be stopped. He saw Wade Mercer out front, the same grim sneer on his face hat, low coat flapping. Behind him rode Emmett Crowley, the elder more cautious, and Caleb trailing, last eyes sharp with the same bitter heat his father carried. Luke slowed before they saw the camp smoke. He raised a hand and shouted, "Whoa there!" The horses reined in. Wade's eyes narrowed. Well, look what slithered out of a tent, Wade said, voice full of rot. Heard you were setting up housekeeping with the savages. Luke didn't rise to it. This is private land. Wasn't marked, Wade said. Doesn't need to be. You're not here by accident. Crowley held his reins with one gloved hand, squinting at the canyon wall behind Luke. We saw smoke. Thought it might be fire trouble. Storm season's not done. You're not the fire brigade, Luke said flatly. Turn around. Caleb spat off the side of his horse. This your land, Travers, close enough. Wade leaned forward, eyes like knife points. How close is she, the one with the braids and soft hands? Luke didn't think. His fist was already flying. It caught Wade across the jaw hard enough to send him backward in the saddle. Wade howled and dropped his reins, grabbing at his cheek. Keep her name out of your mouth, Luke growled. Wade pulled his revolver, but Crowley was faster. Enough, the older man barked, raising a hand. Put it away, Wade. You're gonna get us shot. Luke held his ground. His own rifle was strapped to the saddle, but his hand rested near the butt of the pistol on his belt. You ride back now, Luke said. No one's hurt. You keep riding forward, someone bleeds. Caleb looked between them, unsure. Wade, breathing hard, wiped blood from the corner of his mouth and stared like he was burning Luke into memory. We're not done, he hissed. Yeah, Luke said. We are. He didn't move until they'd turned their horses and disappeared over the far ridge, the sound of hooves fading into the wind. Only then did he let out a breath. By the time he returned to camp, Sahale was crouched on a rock above the clearing, her rifle across her lap. Nelina waited near the spring arms wrapped tightly around herself. They're gone, Luke said. For now, Sahale muttered. Nelina's eyes met his. You're bleeding. Luke touched his lip, surprised to find blood. He made a comment. Wade Mercer doesn't make comments, she said. He makes threats. They sat by the fire later, the three of them, quiet, each turning over the encounter in their heads. Sahale sharpened her blade with long, even strokes, the sound scratching through the silence. They'll come back, she said. Luke nodded, probably with more men. Sahale looked at him directly. Then we should move. No, Luke said. You shouldn't have to run. You think we have a choice, Sahale snapped. We've been running since we were children. From soldiers, from settlers, from anyone who thinks we don't belong on land that raised us. Luke didn't speak for a moment. Then he said, You belong more than any of them. Sahale's jaw worked. Then she stood and walked toward the darkness at the edge of the clearing. Nelina touched Luke's arm. She's scared. So am I. She looked at him. You stood between them and this place. That matters. Not enough, he said. Not if they come back with guns and papers and friends. She didn't argue. She just moved closer, resting her hand on his. Her fingers were warm, steady. We can't stay hidden forever, Luke said quietly. Something's coming, and I think it knows our names. That night he couldn't sleep. He sat outside the teepee rifle across his knees, eyes tracing the shadows that danced with the firelight. The stars overhead blinked cold and distant. The spring gurgled, the only sound besides the wind. Footsteps behind him, light as thought. I made tea, Nelina said, handing him a warm tin cup. Thanks. She sat beside him, the silence between them thick with everything unsaid. He drank slow, savoring the heat. I used to think I'd die alone, he said. She didn't flinch. I used to think I'd never trust a man again. He looked at her. Her eyes were soft, but her spine was straight. Not a woman looking to be saved. A woman who had saved herself again and again. But now he asked. Now I think we might survive, she said. If we trust the right hands. He turned his hand up. She placed hers in it without hesitation. They sat that way until the fire fell low. When morning came, it brought a brittle sky and the hard promise of wind. Luke stood near the edge of camp, watching the ridge, his gut tight. Sahali joined him, quiet. "I didn't thank you," she said. "You don't have to." "I do," she said. "You stood with us. That counts." He looked over at her, surprised. There was something softer in her face. Not trust, not yet, but the wall had thinned. "You think Mercer will ride again?" "Yes," she said. "But now we know the sound of his horse." Luke stared off across the open space. "The next time we'll be ready." Behind them, Nalina stoked the fire. Smoke curled into the wind like a signal they were no longer hiding. They weren't done running, but they weren't backing down either. "You said you stood for us. Now we'll see if you meant it." The first shot cracked through the morning like a whip. Luke dropped the bucket he was carrying and ran, heart hammering in his chest. The echo bounced off the canyon walls, too close, too sharp to be warning fire. His boots pounded through mud still wet from the evening melt, breath tight in his chest. Sahali was already crouched behind the low rock ledge that bordered the camp, rifle tight to her shoulder. Eyes narrowed into the sunlight. Where he asked, skidding beside her. North Ridge. Came in fast, 3 riders. He didn't need to ask who. He already knew. Nalina was hurrying from the teepee, skirts pulled up in one hand, a satchel of herbs in the other. Her eyes were wide but steady. "Get inside," Luke told her. "I won't hide. You're not hiding. You're staying alive." She hesitated, then nodded, slipping behind the teepee wall. Another shot. It struck the rock beside Sahali's cover, sending a chip flying past Luke's ear. Sahali hissed. That one was close. Luke pulled his rifle from where it leaned against the supply stack. He checked the chamber heart slamming against his ribs. "Wade's not here to talk this time." "Then he'll get a different kind of answer," Sahali said. Across the field, movement flickered between the trees. Then they saw them, 3 riders fanning out, one moving around to the east, another holding back by the trail, the third creeping down the slope, straight toward the camp. Wade. He was out front again, hunched low, gun in hand, hate etched across his face like it had been carved into his skin. Luke took aim, but Sahali grabbed his arm. "Wait," she whispered. "He's drawing you out, wants to flush us. He won't hesitate, neither will I." Behind them, the teepee flap rustled. Luke turned. "Stay inside, Nalina." But it wasn't her. It was Rosario. She had arrived quietly as she always did, her shawl pulled tight, a basket of dried roots slung over one shoulder. She ducked behind the cooking stones with an annoyed grunt. "You people know how to throw a welcome party." "Rosario, what are you doing here?" Luke asked. "Bringing medicine." "I didn't think I needed a gun." Luke cursed under his breath. "You need to stay down. I'll stay down when the sky falls," she muttered, pulling something from her basket. "Now you just focus on not dying." Another shot rang out, this one striking the edge of the water barrel, splintering wood and sending a spray into the dirt. Luke raised his rifle and fired back, hitting the bark of a pine near Wade's position. The crack of it made Wade duck and roll, retreating to cover. "We can't hold here long," Sahale said. "No," Luke agreed. "But we can hold long enough." Then came the sound they'd been dreading, hooves from the ridge, more than 3. A second group was coming in fast. The dust they kicked rose in a spiral. "Reinforcements," Sahale muttered. Luke felt his stomach drop. How many? 5, maybe 6. He looked at her. "Can you hit Wade from here?" She was already taking aim. "On my mark," he said. "One shot to rattle him." Sahal nodded. Luke raised his head over the rocks. "Wade," he shouted. "This is your last chance to turn back. A bullet snapped past his cheek in reply. Sahali fired. Wade's hat flew off as he dove for the ground. A near miss. Close enough to make him curse, loud enough to echo. Behind Luke, a new voice rang out. That's enough, everyone froze. At the edge of the ridge rode Sheriff Clay Rios, rifle across his saddle badge glinting like firelight in the sun. Behind him rode 2 deputies armed and ready. Clay reined in hard. Lower your weapons. Now Wade stood slowly furious and cornered. They're squatters, Sheriff. You saw it yourself, they're harboring. They're not harboring anyone, Clay cut in. They're living. Quietly, legally. And you just opened fire on them. They're off the reservation. They're not on your land. Wade's face twisted. You gonna take his word over mine? Luke stood tall beside the stone. His heart was still beating hard, his jaw tight, but his voice came out calm. You already tried to kill me once, Wade. Now you brought 6 men with you. Doesn't look much like justice. Sheriff Rios raised his rifle a hair. Wade Mercer, you and your men are under arrest for unlawful aggression and attempted murder. Drop your weapons. Wade didn't move. For a second, Luke thought he might pull the trigger anyway. Then Caleb's horse shifted behind him, and the boy said, "This ain't worth hanging for." He dropped his gun. The others followed. Wade spat in the dirt, but he let his weapon fall. Rios nodded. Good choice. The deputies moved in, rounding them up. Luke lowered his rifle. His legs felt unsteady now that it was over. He turned to check the camp. No one had been hit. The teepee stood untouched. Nalina stepped out slowly, her face unreadable. When she reached him, her hands trembled as they touched his face, brushing dust and sweat from his cheek. You could have died, she whispered. For you, Luke said, I'd face worse. Sahali stood beside them, now arms folded, blinking quickly against the wind. We stand together, she said. That's how we survive. Rosario stepped into the clearing, brushing dirt off her skirt. I told you, she said. Storms don't just come from the sky. Luke turned toward the ridge where Wade and his men were being led away. It was done, and something new had begun. No preacher, no papers, just 2 hearts saying yes. Evening came with a hush, as if the wind itself had bowed its head. The camp was still not from fear, but from a quietness that comes after something hard has passed. Smoke from the fire curled upward, slow and silver in the fading light. The creek whispered nearby, soft over stone. For the first time in weeks, there were no riders to watch, for no threats carried on the breeze. Only the scent of pine and warming earth and the faintest hint of sweetness from the tea Nalena had been steeping. Luke sat near the fire, cleaning his rifle more from habit than necessity. His knuckles were scabbed, his ribs still sore from the days before, but his chest was lighter. The weight of constant watching had eased. In its place was something unfamiliar but welcome, like standing in a room where the walls had fallen away. Nalina stepped from the teepee, wrapped in her shawl, a fresh braid falling over her shoulder. She carried no bundles, no tools, no satchels of herbs, just herself. Luke rose, pulse steady but strong. She came to him without hesitation. It's time, she said. He nodded, setting the rifle aside. They walked together up the low slope behind the camp, where the ground leveled beneath the open sky. Sahale waited there, already standing by the fire she'd built from dry cedar branches. Her face was solemn, but there was warmth behind her stillness. Beside her sat Rosario, humming something low and steady as she crushed dried leaves in her palm. No one spoke as the flames caught. The fire rose quick and clean, crackling with heat and color. Luke stood on one side, Nalina on the other. Sahali looked at them both, then stepped back, letting the silence hold. This isn't a wedding. Nalina said, her voice strong in the quiet. There are no rings, no laws, no judge. Luke didn't move. No preacher, no papers, he said. Just two hearts saying yes. Nalina smiled. Not wide, but real. They stepped closer until the fire was between them, but their hands could meet over the flames. Luke reached for her first. She met him halfway. Her hand was warm, calloused but soft, steady. I don't have words written down, he said, throat dry. All I know is I didn't come here looking for anything. I came here dying in the snow. Her fingers squeezed his. And I found you, he said. And now I don't know how to be without you. She lifted her chin, eyes catching the firelight. I lived in a world that taught me not to trust, she said, not to let my heart show. But I watched you stand when it was easier to run. And I saw how your silence holds meaning, not distance. She stepped around the fire until she stood in front of him. I choose you, she said. He exhaled slowly. I choose you too. Rosario wiped the corner of her eye with her sleeve, muttering something about dust. Sahele looked at her sister, then at Luke, and gave a small nod. They sealed their vows not with anything grand, but with a kiss, gentle, honest, the kind that felt like a beginning. The kind that didn't need witnesses, only truth. The fire burned lower as the stars emerged one by one, blinking through the darkness, like eyes opened for the first time. Later, the four of them sat around the embers, eating a stew Rosario had thrown together, with what she called a pinch of love and a threat of salt. Laughter came easier now, especially from Sahale, who had begun to let her shoulders rest in the presence of safety. After the meal, Sahale rose and walked with Luke as he fetched more firewood. The moon lit their path in silver. She's different now, Sahale said. Luke looked over. Nalina. She hasn't smiled that much since our mother died. Luke was quiet a moment. You know I'll do everything I can to protect her. I know, Sahale said. But it's not protection she needs most. It's someone who'll stay. He met her gaze. I'm not going anywhere. They returned to the fire where Nalina sat cross-legged, threading new beads into a design Luke hadn't seen before. When he asked her what it meant, she looked up and said, home. That night he didn't sleep in the teepee or out by the fence. He slept beside Nalina, the fire still glowing low, her hand in his, the sound of the creek whispering a lullaby meant only for them. It wasn't a church, but it was sacred. Not by tradition, but by choice. You never really leave the past behind, you just learn how to carry it different. The storm rolled in without warning. One moment the sky was clear, the next it was the color of bruised metal. The wind rose hard and fast, snapping through the trees with a sound like tearing cloth. Luke was halfway back from the ridge with firewood when the first bolt of lightning split the horizon. It hit somewhere east, close enough that he felt the ground shudder. He dropped the bundle of wood and broke into a run. By the time he reached the clearing, the teepee flap was lashing open and shut in the wind, Nalina trying to tie it down. Sahale was shouting something from the edge of the camp, pointing toward the waterline where their drying supplies had been knocked loose and scattered. Get inside, Luke yelled as another crack of thunder shook the basin. We have to get the hides in, Sahale called back. I'll do it, Luke said, already lunging toward the creek bed. Rain started, then fat drops falling hard enough to sting. The wind twisted down the canyon, carrying dust and grit and that sharp electric scent of oncoming fury. Rosario appeared out of nowhere, cloak flapping like a crow's wing. She helped Sahale gather the last of the meat strips and ducked into the teepee teeth clenched against the cold. Inside it was dim and loud, the rain hammering against the hide walls like drumming fists. The fire sputtered, but held. Luke stood just inside the entrance, soaked through and breathing hard. Nalina came to him, pulling his wet shirt from his shoulders, guiding him to sit. "You could have waited," she said, pressing a cloth to his cheek where a branch had struck him. "You'd have done the same." She gave him a look. "That doesn't mean it was smart." The wind shrieked, and for a moment the world outside vanished in a blur of sound and fury. Luke leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes flicking to the smoke hole above them. "I've seen storms like this before," he said. "Once back in Montana. Wind took the whole north wall of the barn, nearly killed a foal." "You always talk about Montana," Sahale said from across the fire, "but you never say what happened there." Luke stared into the flames, jaw tightening. "Because I don't like remembering it." Rosario set a pot over the fire, her movements steady despite the noise. "Sometimes we don't have the luxury of forgetting." Luke didn't answer. Nalina knelt beside him. "We're not asking to dig up your ghosts, but if they're still bleeding, they'll find a way out." He looked up at her eyes, shadowed. "I was engaged. Years ago. Before I came south. Her name was Clara. We had a place near Helena. Small, but we were building something. Or thought we were." "What happened?" Sahali asked. "Same as it always does when someone wants land that's not theirs." He looked down. "There was a mining company. Surveyors said our property line was wrong, that she'd signed something she didn't understand. She fought it in court." He paused. His voice, when it came again, was rough. "They ran her buggy off a ravine on her way back from town, called it an accident. But I knew, and there wasn't a damn thing I could prove." Silence followed, broken only by the rain pounding above. "I sold what was left," Luke said. "Came here, built something small, tried to live quiet." Rosario stirred the pot. "You didn't run. You survived. Doesn't feel like much of a difference some days." "You're here," Nalina said. "That's enough." Lightning flashed again, lighting her face. The storm seemed to retreat a little, as if the worst of it had passed. "You never really leave the past behind," Rosario said, setting bowls in front of them. "You just learn how to carry it different." They ate in silence, grateful for the warmth. Outside, the wind softened, and the rain became a whisper. When the worst had passed, Luke stepped outside. The ground was torn water running in dark rivers down the slope. The creek was higher, swollen and angry, but the teepee stood and the fire still burned. Nalina joined him. She slipped her arm around his waist, leaning into his side. "Storms passed," she said. "For now," he replied. "There'll be others." She looked up at him. "We're not alone anymore." He kissed her forehead. "That's what makes the storms bearable." They walked together down to the creek, checking the damage. A few poles knocked loose, a broken clay jar, but nothing they couldn't fix. Behind them, Rosario and Sahale began rebuilding the drying rack, working side by side without a word. Later, when the stars returned, Luke sat with Nalina under the open sky. The ground was wet, the air sharp with clean earth, and the fire behind them glowed steady. "I still carry her," he said softly. "I know," Nalina replied, "just like I carry my mother, and my people, and every place we had to leave behind." He took her hand. "Maybe we can carry it all, together." She leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. "That's what home is," she said. "A place where you don't have to carry it alone." And under that vast, quiet sky, it finally felt true. Peace isn't quiet. It's something you build with your hands and guard with your whole heart. Spring came early that year. The wind turned warm and dry, carrying the scent of juniper and rain-damp sage. The snow melted off the ridges faster than usual, feeding the creek, until it ran clear and strong through the valley. Buds unfurled along the branches, and the deer began moving lower, closer to camp, their coats shaggy from winter, but their eyes alert with hunger and instinct. Luke stood at the edge of the fence line, hammer in hand, adjusting a crooked post. His hands were stained with sap, and dirt shirt rolled to his elbows, a streak of sweat along his jaw. The sun was just high enough to warm his back, not yet harsh. Nalina watched him from the garden patch, where the wild onion had returned brighter and thicker than before. She was kneeling, hands deep in the soil, a quiet rhythm to her movements. The sleeves of her cotton dress were smudged at the elbows, her braid tucked back under a cloth wrap to keep the wind from tangling it. She looked up when he stepped closer. "That post still giving you trouble?" she asked. "Leaning like an old drunk," Luke said. "But it'll hold." He bent down beside her, digging his fingers into the earth beside hers. For a moment they worked without talking, just the sound of birds calling overhead and the creek murmuring behind them. Nalina brushed her hand over a soft sprout. "This one wasn't here last year." Luke glanced at it. Might be something new. She looked at him, a smile pulling at the corner of her mouth. "That doesn't scare you anymore?" "No," he said. "I think I like not knowing what's going to bloom." He sat back, wiping his hands on his pants. "I've been thinking. That stretch of land up near the West Ridge. There's space for more. If we clear it, we could plant beans, or even build another shelter." Nalina tilted her head. "You want to stay that long?" Luke's voice was steady. "I want to build something that lasts." She reached over and covered his hand with hers. "You already are." They returned to the camp as the sun crested above the trees. Sahale was mending one of the hide coverings near the fire, her needle moving in clean, sharp arcs. Rosario sat beside her, weaving dried corn husks into rope, humming a low tune from somewhere deep in memory. "You've been quiet this morning," Sahale said without looking up. Rosario nodded toward the horizon. "Sky's too clear. It's up to something." Luke dropped another armload of wood near the fire. "You think trouble's coming?" Rosario shrugged. "Not trouble exactly. Just change." He exchanged a look with Sahale, who tied off her thread and stood stretching her back. "Maybe that's not a bad thing." "I didn't say it was," Rosario replied. "Just that it always comes." They spent the afternoon preparing for a small gathering. Nothing big, just a meal shared in thanks. Sheriff Clay Rios had written ahead, promising to bring a few things from town: sugar lamp oilcloth and books for the coming season. The kind of things that couldn't be hunted or gathered. By late afternoon, smoke curled up from the cooking stones, the scent of roasting venison filling the air. A simple table had been set with blankets and bowls. Wildflowers in a carved gourd sat in the center, Nalina's touch. Luke saw Rios first cresting the ridge alone, had pulled low against the sun. He rode easy reins, loose in one hand, a small pack tied behind the saddle. He waved when he saw them, and Luke waved back. "Glad you found the trail," Luke said when he reached the clearing. "Hard to miss with the smoke," Rios replied. He dismounted and tied his horse near the edge of the trees. "Brought what I could. Supplies from Miss Hartwell's store and a book of poems she swore you'd like." Rosario snorted. "Poems. Lord help us." Sahale took the bundle, sorting it with quick eyes. "This'll stretch us through summer." "Thank her." They ate together as the sun dipped lower. Laughter came easy now, and conversation moved without strain. Rios told a story about a fox getting into the schoolhouse pantry. Sahale told one about chasing a bear off the drying rack with only a pine branch and a curse. Even Rosario laughed, her shoulders shaking as she covered her mouth. When the food was done and the stars blinked to life, Rios leaned back against a log. "You folks have built something rare out here," he said. I've been riding this territory 15 years. Seen a lot of places fall apart over less. Luke nodded slowly. We've had enough broken. Rios's tone shifted softer now. There's talk in town about what happened with Wade. Some still think you ought to leave. Luke didn't flinch. And I think men like Wade got loud when they're scared. And scared men make bad choices. He paused. But I also think peace is like a fence. It don't stand on its own. You gotta watch it mend it. Hold the line when it starts to lean. Luke looked around the clearing at the firelight dancing on the teepee walls at Sahale, polishing her blade at Nalina, leaning against him, calm and present. We're holding it, Luke said. With both hands. Rios stood brushing off his coat. Then I'll keep writing your name clean. You've earned that much. He rode out before the moon was high, his horse moving slow but sure down the slope. Afterward, Luke and Nalina walked along the creek in silence. The moonlight spilled across the water, pale and quiet. She stopped and turned to him. You ever wonder if it'll last? Luke touched her cheek. Every day. And I still choose it. She smiled. Then I do too. They stood there a while, listening to the night. Peace wasn't a silence or the absence of threat. It was work. It was watching the fences and feeding the fire and making space for new things to grow. It was forgiveness and trust and standing close when storms came. And it was here now, held in the strength of their joined hands, guarded by the land, and built with everything they had left to give. The educational lesson learned from this story is that healing doesn't come from running or forgetting, but from choosing to stay through fear, through loss, and through change. It reminds us that peace isn't given. It's made moment by the hands willing to build it, and the hearts brave enough to protect it. Even after deep sorrow, it's never too late to find purpose, to stand beside someone, and to make a place feel like home again.